Hi guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome to another video. So in this video I am going to do another ranking for you, and this time I am going to rank all of the Scream movies. This is the 6 Scream movies that have been released, including the new one which we have just had released in the last few days. So yeah, let's just get straight into it. So just before I get into the ranking, I just want to warn you that there may be minor spoilers for Scream 6 in this video. I'm not going to give any plot details away, nothing major, but I may potentially say things that you might not want to hear if you haven't seen Scream 6. So yeah, that's just a quick little spoiler warning. Right, so into 6th and last place. Now I might get a little bit of hate for this one, and some of you might be saying I'm maybe a bit hasty with my choice, but I am going to go with Scream 6 in last place. So with Scream 6, we follow the surviving characters from the last movie, the likes of Sam and Tara, Mindy, Chad. They've all relocated to New York. Some of them have started college and some of them are just there because yeah, why not? And before we know it, we find a new rash of Ghostface killings start taking place. If you've seen all the other Scream movies, you'll know exactly what's going to happen in that sense. But why do I rank this movie last? Well, I went to see this movie at the cinema, and it was the first time I'd seen a Scream movie, and I came out feeling kind of underwhelmed by it. I just found this movie quite messy in terms of the plot, and I also just felt it just felt a bit tired to me. It had a very seen it all before kind of feel, and one of the most underwhelming last acts I've ever seen in a Scream movie. The reveal of the killers was kind of predictable and not that special. One big problem I did have with this movie in regards to the reveal of the killer is that in this movie, it's only going to be a very small number of people. You go back to the first Scream movie or even the second Scream movie, and in the immortal words of Randy, everybody is a suspect in those movies. But in this movie, that the killer is only going to be, one of a very small group of characters. And that was very disappointing to me. I also felt this movie was kind of lacking in terms of scares and genuine tension. There was never really any point in the movie where I felt like I was on the edge of my seat and I was wondering what was going to happen next. It all just felt very, very safe, and the stakes just weren't very high for me. And also, even though this movie takes place in New York, I didn't feel like they really utilized the location as best they could. Yeah, okay, it doesn't cop out like Jason Takes Manhattan infamously did, but I still feel like this movie takes place in any sort of generic US city. It doesn't really feel like New York, apart from maybe a few little sequences, maybe some sequences with the subway. But other than that, this movie could have took place in any US city for me. I think the only thing I genuinely liked about this movie was the characters. Like I said before, a lot of the surviving characters from the previous movie are back here, and I think they're a very likable bunch of characters. The actors who portray them are very good, and yeah, they definitely hold this movie together for me. But other than that, I just found this to be a very weak and underwhelming entry to the franchise. So yeah, for those reasons, I have to put Scream 6 into 6th place. Right, so into 5th place now, and I am going to go with Scream 4. So yeah, Scream 4 takes place about 10 years after the end of the last movie. In this one, we find Sidney Prescott is now the author of a self-help book, and she is on a book tour, and the last stop of her tour is in her hometown of Woodsboro. And while she's there, she decides to reconnect with Dewey and Gail, who are now a married couple. Dewey is now the sheriff of Woodsboro. And Sydney also decides to spend some time with her cousin Jill, played by Emma Roberts. And then, of course, with the return of Sydney signals a new spree of Ghostface killings. So this movie has always been a really strange movie for me. When it came out in 2011, it was meant to be the beginning of a brand new trilogy, but because of the poor performance of this movie at the box office, the plans for that trilogy were effectively scrapped. So this movie kind of feels a bit unfinished, and it feels like the odd one out in the franchise, especially since we've had the release of these newer movies, which, whilst they are sequels, they do kind of feel like they're slightly rebooting the franchise as well. And yeah, when I watch this movie, it just feels like I can kind of skip it altogether, and that it almost doesn't feel canon to me. But other than that, I've always found this movie to be a bit middle of the road. It was meant to be sort of like the triumphant return for the franchise at the time it came out, but I just find this movie very formulaic. Again, I think the last act is really lacking. I wasn't a fan of the reveal of the killer. It's great to see the legacy characters back, and they do have quite a lot to do in this movie. Definitely in comparison to these newer Scream movies, but I find a lot of the newer characters in this movie to be really obnoxious and really annoying. Emma Roberts' character in particular, I just don't think she's a very interesting protagonist, if I'm being totally honest. It's still a fun movie nonetheless. It's great that Wes Craven was able to come back and direct this movie, and you can feel his touch on the movie. There's some good killings in it. We've got that self-referential tone back in it. The beginning of the movie in particular is quite amusing, although for my taste, it does kind of take that self-referential tone just a little bit too far. But other than that, it is a fun movie, but like I said, it just feels very standalone-ish. And yeah, it could have been better. But in the end, it just feels a bit too average and a bit too formulaic for me. So yeah, that's why Scream 4 falls into 5th place. Right, so into 4th place now, and I am going to go with Scream 3. So with Scream 3, this was at the time the last chapter in the Scream trilogy. In this one, we find Dewey, Gale, and Sidney kind of trying to move on from the events of the previous movies. But in this one, we find a new spree of Ghostface killings are happening on the set of Stab 3. The Stab movies are, of course, these movies within the movie based on the killings from the previous Scream movies. Now, I know a lot of people who really dislike this movie and consider it the most controversial entry in the franchise. I know a lot of people probably consider it the absolute worst. Now, when I first saw this movie, I remember I did not like it at all. I was really disappointed in what they did with it. But over time, it has kind of grown on me, this movie, and I feel like it does have a little bit more to say than the previous movies that I've already mentioned. I think the main problem with this movie is its tone. I do feel like it leans a little bit more into the comedic aspect as opposed to the horror and violence. And I think this movie just suffered from bad timing, because at the time it came out, the Columbine High School massacre had not long happened, and after that tragic event occurred, a lot of people were starting to look towards movies and video games and things like that as to whether they were sort of responsible for, these young kids performing these terrible acts. So the producers were kind of had no choice but to tone down the violence in this movie and go more in a comedic direction. And I think that's the main problem people have with this movie. And yeah, it definitely does go way too far in that route. But I still think this movie is kind of fun, and I think it is a fairly satisfactory concluding chapter to the initial trilogy. I know a lot of people have issues with the sort of the somewhat retconning of the events of the first movie, especially with the killer in this one being having a connection to the killers from the first Scream movie, but it never really bothered me, that plot aspect. I always felt it was justifiable enough. Yes, this movie does kind of it does kind of become what the Scream franchise was spoofing in the first place, and it definitely falls into that trap of becoming a caricature of itself. But I still have a fairly decent time with this movie, and like I said, I do feel like it has a little bit more to say than the movies I've already mentioned, and it is a somewhat satisfactory conclusion to that trilogy. It could have been a lot better, but for me, it could have been a lot worse. But yeah, Scream 3 falls into 4th place. Right, so into third place now, and I am going to go with Scream, otherwise known as Scream 5. So yeah, this is the movie that has pretty much resurrected the franchise. In this one, it again takes place in Woodsboro and follows a completely new set of younger characters. We've got Jenna Ortega in there playing Tara, Melissa Barrera playing Sam, and a whole host of other new characters. But we are also supported by some legacy characters like Dewey, Gale, and of course, Sydney. On the whole, I thought this movie was a pretty decent attempt at reigniting this franchise, and I genuinely have a good time with this movie. Like I said with Scream 6, I think these new characters are, on the whole, fairly likable, and I just like the performances from these new actors. I think there's some great gore in this movie. There's some great sequences involving Ghostface. I think Ghostface in particular is, really cruel, really mean-spirited in this movie, and I kind of enjoy that aspect of it. I thought the story on the whole was pretty decent. Flawed, yes, but on the whole, I thought it was pretty good. The only sort of issue I have with this movie is the use of the legacy characters. I know a lot of people say it's great to see the likes of Sydney and Gale back, but for me, they just didn't do anything totally worthwhile in this movie. They only really show up at the ending, and even then, they don't really do a whole lot. I feel like those two characters could have been absent from this movie, and it would have just been the exact same movie. They just didn't have any sort of effect on the plot. The only legacy character that does is the character of Dewey Riley. But other than that, I think it's a very enjoyable entry in the franchise, and I thought it was a good return to form after Scream 3 and Scream 4. So yeah, that is Scream 5 in third place. Right, so into second place now, and I am going to go with Scream 2. So Scream 2 takes place not too long after the end of Scream. We find the character of Sydney is now attending college and trying to move on from the events of the first movie, but of course, Ghostface killings start occurring again on this college campus. So when I was growing up and first discovering the Scream movies, Scream 2 was always one that I always held really high in regard, and there was times where I used to consider this the absolute best of the franchise. It's just a testament to how much I love this movie. I think it is a fantastic sequel that takes everything that was great about the original and just completely elevates it, makes it bigger and better. One scene in particular I love from this movie is the opening. I really love how they don't try to replicate the opening sequence of the first movie and they go in a completely different direction. Obviously, with the first movie, we have Drew Barrymore's character who is in this house in the middle of nowhere being stalked by the killer. But in this one, we follow a couple of characters who are at a movie theater. It's packed full of people. You couldn't imagine it being a dangerous place to be. But of course, this movie says differently. But I just love that opening sequence. It's just awesome. And there's just so many other great moments in it. Some really tense sequences. There's a scene with Sydney trapped in the car with Ghostface. There's a scene where Gale's being stalked by Ghostface in that studio of the university campus. There's just so many great moments, and we have a huge cast of characters in this movie. And I found it was quite difficult to guess the identity of the killer in this movie because there's just a huge list of suspects. And yeah, I think the finale of this movie is very surprising and really awesome. I just love this movie. It's not quite as good as my number one entry, but I think it is a fantastic sequel, and yeah, definitely the best sequel in the franchise. So that is Scream 2 in second place. Right, so into first place now, and it is, of course, the original Scream from 1996. I don't need to talk too much about the plot with this one. You've already heard what I've said about the other movies, so you probably know the plot to this Scream movie, especially if you're watching this video. But yeah, this is just a fantastic horror movie from the 90s, and I always feel like this movie was the movie that kind of saved horror, because I know a lot of people say that horror is a genre that's never really died, and I do agree with that. However, I do think that horror did have a slight dip in the early 90s. I mean, I can't really think of any iconic horror movie from the years 1990 to 1995. I mean, sure, there was a lot of horror movies that definitely came out in those years, but none that I would say are iconic, nothing like The Exorcist or The Shining, movies like that. But I feel like once Scream came out in 1996, it completely revitalized the genre, and in particular the slasher genre. And then we had a whole host of copycat movies and spoofs and all sorts. And yeah, it's just one of those movies that has just etched itself in pop culture movie history. It's just a fantastic horror movie. All of the characters are really likable. It's really thrilling. You've got a huge list of suspects in this movie. Anybody could be the killer in it. And yeah, it's just an absolute blast from start to finish. And I can't say anything negative about this movie. It's just a horror classic. So yeah, that is Scream in first place. So there you go, guys. That is my ranking for the Scream franchise. I really hope you've enjoyed this video, and let me know in the comments what you think of my ranking. Do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? What would be your ranking? What are your thoughts on the Scream franchise in general? I would absolutely love to see your comments and hear your thoughts. But until then, I will leave the video there. So thanks again for watching, and take care.